Part 1. Little Bald Doctors. There is a gulf fixed between those who can sleep and those who cannot. It is one of the greatest divisions of the human race. Iris Murdoch, Nuns and Soldiers. Chapter 1. Part 1. About a month after the death of his wife, Ralph Roberts began to suffer from insomnia for the first time in his life. The problem was mild to begin with, but it grew steadily worse. 6 months after the first interruptions in his heretofore unremarkable sleep cycle, Ralph had reached a state of misery he could hardly credit, let alone accept. Toward the end of summer of 1993, he began to wonder what it would be like to spend his remaining years on Earth in a starry-eyed daze of wakefulness. Of course it wouldn't come to that, he told himself. It never does. But was it true? He really didn't know. That was the devil of it, and the books on the subject Mike Hanlon steered him to down at the Derry Public Library weren't much help. There were several on sleep disorders, but they seemed to contradict one another. Some called insomnia a symptom, others called it a disease, and at least one called it a myth. The problem went further than that, however. So far as Ralph could tell from the books, no one seemed exactly sure what sleep itself was, how it worked, or what it did. He knew he should quit playing amateur researcher and go to the doctor, but he found that surprisingly hard to do. He supposed he still bore Dr. Litchfield a grudge. It was Litchfield, after all, who had originally diagnosed Carolyn's brain tumor as tension headaches. Except that Ralph had an idea that Litchfield, a lifelong bachelor, might actually have believed that Carolyn was suffering from nothing but a moderate case of the vapors. And Litchfield, who had made himself as scarce as medically possible once Carolyn was diagnosed. Ralph was positive that if he had asked the man about that point blank, Litchfield would have said he had handed the case off to Jamal the specialist. All quite proper and above board. Yes. Except Ralph had made it his business to get a good look into Litchfield's eyes on the few occasions he had seen him between Carolyn's first convulsions last July and her death this March. And Ralph thought that what he'd seen in those eyes was a mixture of unease and guilt. It was the look of a man trying very hard to forget he had fucked up. Ralph believed the only reason he could still look at Litchfield without wanting to knock his ass out was that Dr. Jamal had told him an earlier diagnosis probably would have made no difference. By the time Carolyn's headache started, the tumor was already well entrenched, and no doubt sending out little bursts of bad cells to other areas of the brain like malignant care packages. In late April, Dr. Jamal had left to establish a practice in southern Connecticut, and Ralph missed him. He thought that he could have talked about his sleeplessness to Dr. Jamal, and he had an idea that Jamal would have listened in a way Litchfield wouldn't, or couldn't. By late summer, Ralph had read enough about insomnia to know that the type with which he was afflicted, while not rare, was a lot less common than the usual slow-sleep insomnia. People unaffected by insomnia are usually in first-stage sleep. First-stage sleep 7 to 20 minutes after turning in. Slow sleepers, on the other hand, sometimes take as long as 3 hours to slip below the surface. Sorry, folks. While normal sleepers begin to ramp down to the third-stage sleep, what some of the old books called theta sleep, Ralph had discovered 45 minutes or so after drifting off. Slow sleepers usually took an additional hour or two to get down there. And on many nights, they did not get all the way down at all. They awoke and refreshed, sometimes with unfocused memories of unpleasant, tingled dreams, more often with the mistaken impression that they had been awake all night. Following Carolyn's death, Ralph began to suffer from premature waking. He continued to go to bed most nights following the conclusion of the 11 o'clock news, and he continued to pop off to sleep almost at once, but instead of waking promptly at 6:45, 5 minutes before the alarm clock radio buzzed, promptly at 6:55, 5 minutes before the clock radio alarm buzzed, he began to wake at 6. At first, he dismissed this as no more than the price of living with a slightly enlarged prostate and a 70-year-old set of kidneys, but he never seemed to have to go that badly when he woke up, and he found it impossible to get back to sleep after he emptied what had accumulated. He simply lay in bed he shared with Carolyn for so many years, waiting for it to be 5 of 7, quarter till anyway, so he could get up. Eventually he gave up even trying to drop off again. He simply lay there with his long fingers, slightly swollen hands laced together in his chest and stared up at the shadowy ceiling with eyes that felt as big as doorknobs. Sometimes he thought of Dr. Jamal down there in Westport, Connecticut, talking in his soft and comforting Indian accent, building up his little piece of the American dream. Sometimes he thought of places he and Caroline had gone in the old days, and the one he kept coming back to was a hot afternoon at Sand Beach in Bar Harbor. The two of them sitting at a picnic table in their bathing suits, sitting under a big bright umbrella, eating sweet fried clams and drinking Budweiser from long-necked bottles as they watched the sailboat scuttling across the dark blue ocean. When had that been? 1964? 1967? Did it matter? Probably not. The alterations in his sleep schedule wouldn't have mattered either if they had ended there. Ralph would have adapted to the changes not just with ease but with gratitude. All the books he'd hunted through that summer seemed to confirm one bit of folk wisdom he'd heard all his life. People slept less as they got older. If losing an hour or so a night was the only fee he had to pay for the dubious pleasure of being, quote, 70 years young, unquote, he would pay it gladly and consider himself well off. But it didn't end there. By the first week of May, Ralph was waking up to birdsong at 5:15. He tried earplugs for a few nights, although he doubted that from the outset that they would work. It wasn't the newly returned birds that were waking him up, nor the occasional delivery truck backfire out on Harris Avenue. He had always been the sort of guy who could sleep in the middle of a brass marching band, and he didn't think that changed. What had changed was inside his head. There was a switch in there. Something was turning on a little earlier every day, and Ralph hadn't the slightest idea of how to keep it from happening. By June, he was popping out of sleep like Jack out of his box at 4:30, 4:45 at the latest. And by the middle of July, not quite as hot as July of '92, but bad enough, thank you very much, he was snapping to it around 4. It was during those long hot nights, taking up too little of the bed where he and Caroline had made love on so many nights, hot nights and cold ones, that he began to consider what a hell his life would become if sleep departed entirely. In daylight he was able to scoff at the notion, but he was discovering certain dismal truths about Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald's dark night of the soul. And the grand prize winner was this. At 4:15 in the morning, any and everything seems possible. Anything. During the days he was able to go on telling himself that he was simply experiencing a readjustment of his sleep cycle, that his body was responding in perfectly normal fashion to a number of big changes in his life. Retirement and the loss of his wife being the two biggest. He sometimes used the word loneliness when he thought about his new life, but he shied away from the dreaded D word, stuffing it back into the deep closet of his subconscious whenever it happened to glimmer for a moment in his thoughts. Loneliness? It was okay, but depression most certainly was not. Maybe he needs to get more exercise, he thought. Do some walking like he used to last summer. After all, you've been leading a pretty sedentary life. Get up, eat toast, read a book, watch some TV, get a sandwich across the street and a red apple for lunch. Potter around in the garden a little, maybe go to the library, visit Helen and the baby if they happen to be out. Eat supper, maybe sit on the porch visit with Bill or Lois Chess for a while. Then what? Read a little bit more, watch a little bit more TV, wash up, go to bed. Sedentary. Boring. No wonder you wake up early. Except that was bullshit. His life sounded sedentary, yes, no doubt, but it really wasn't. The garden was a good example. What he did out there was never going to win him any prizes. But it was a hell of a long way from, quote, pottering around, unquote. Most afternoons he weeded until sweat made a dark tree shape around the back of his shirt and spit damp circles at his armpits. He was often trembling with exhaustion by the time he let himself go back inside. Quote, punishment, unquote, probably would have been closer to the mark than pottering, quote unquote. But punishment for what? Waking up before dawn? Ralph didn't know and just didn't give a fuck. Working in the garden filled up a large piece of the afternoon. He took his mind off things he didn't really care to think of, and that was enough to justify the aching muscles and the occasional flights of black spots in the front of his eyes. He began his extended visits to the garden shortly after the 4th of July and continued all through August, long after the early crops had been harvested and the later ones had been hopelessly stunted by the lack of rain. "You ought to quit that," Bill told him one night as they sat on the porch drinking lemonade. This was in mid-August, and Ralph had begun to wake up around 3:30 each morning. "It's got to be hazardous to your health. Worse, you look like a lunatic." "Maybe I am a lunatic," Ralph responded shortly. Neither his tone nor the look in his eyes must have been convincing because Bill changed the subject.